Good evening and a very warm welcome from the Bali to the program Repairing History. This program is a joint effort between the Bali Institut Français and the Goethe Institute. And I'd like to welcome the audience here in the room. A very warm welcome to you, and it's great to have live people here again after 1.5 years. But I would also like to welcome our audience in Dakar, Senegal, who are watching from there as well. And of course, everybody watching from their home, a warm welcome to you. We just saw a selection of scenes and excerpts from the project Objects Interlacing. Objects Interlacing is a recent video installation by the French-Algerian artist Kader Attia. And the question central to this work is how, if possible, to repair the damage from illegally obtained objects within a colonial context. Over the past years, museums from France, Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands and their governments have taken steps in this regard. They approved the restitution of several objects in their countries to the countries of origin, which is a positive sign, but still in that context very weird as well. Do they need approval in order to do that? But what does that mean in terms of dealing with the colonial past? Is there a context there? And is there a way to deal with the past through the objects here? And which other further actions could or should be taken? Tonight we will discuss these questions with experts from several established museums, and I would like to introduce them all. Our first guest who joins us through Zoom is Amadi Bokoum, who is a Senegalese researcher and director of the MCN, Musée des Civilisations Noires in Dakar, and the museum opened its doors in 2019. Amadi, are you there?
Bien, je suis bien là depuis Dakar.
Here I am. Good afternoon from Dakar. Good evening. I'm talking to you from Institut Français of Dakar. Good evening to you all.
A very warm welcome to you. And we hear the translator here as well, so that's why there's a slight delay and you hear two different voices speaking when Amadi speaks. We will return to you, Amadi, within our conversation a bit later, but first I would like to take the time to introduce our next guest. I'll start on my left-hand side. For the viewers on your right, that's Pap Njai. Very well, welcome to you. You're a French historian and you're the head of the National Museum of the History of Immigration in Paris. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Marion Ackerman, who sits on my left for the audience, on the left-hand side, is a German art historian, curator, and director of the SKD. Those entail 15 Dresden state art collections, and they include, if I'm correct, 3 ethnological museums as well, in Leipzig, in Dresden, and in another city that's...
Herrnhut.
That is unknown to us here in the Netherlands. But thank you for joining us here as well. Our next guest is Nanette Snoep. You're a Dutch anthropologist, a curator, and director of the Rautenstrauß-Jost Museum Kulturen der Welt in Cologne, Germany.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. And last but not least is our guest Falika Smulders. She's a Dutch academic, curator and head of the Department of History at the National Museum of Amsterdam, which is known as the Rijksmuseum, and somebody I know very closely because we collaborated together on the slavery exhibition that just closed its doors. Unfortunately, hopefully it will be seen later on in a different form, possibly. Is that feasible?
I think it's feasible.
That sounds...
Can't say any more at the moment, but yes, I'm hoping so.
That sounds very, very hopeful. We will return to you all in a bit, but Amadi, if I can go to you. Europe is moving towards a restitution of colonial-era objects, and the question I would like to pose is, do you think it's up to European museums and governments to approve restitution? What is your stance in regard to that?
Mon point de vue, c'est que...
Yes, my point of view is that the positions are diverse. Maybe there is a content that museums would like to share, which is an advancement in this collection for some of them regarding some objects that have been looted during the colonial period or which are trophies. And this is more sensitive when we think about Abomey, when we think about Benin City, or Madagascar, etc., where elements of the crown have been stolen. European countries are reacting in a different way. maybe the solution or the easiest solution, they didn't accept it. It was the international instrument that the Convention of 1970 of UNESCO on the traffic, which disposed in its Article 15 the possibility for states which took part in the convention to arrange and the restitutions, and the Intergovernmental Committee had been created in 1978 at the eve of the core appeal of Amadou Moktambo related to the restitution of cultural assets. And when we look at all this, let me start with France, because we have a keen interest in France. And when you look at the Museum of Cape Henley, which has a lot of objects from Senegal and other objects from former French Africa, we are particularly interested in Cape Henley, and the report of Benedict Savoy that we've listened to in the extract of the movie we've just watched, it's really exhaustive on the importance and of the collection of artifacts that are in that museum. Now, these collections have integrated French heritage. They've become inalienable since Molière time, which institutes royal heritage. And naturally, anytime you would like to talk about it, you have to refer to laws. We'll go to National Assembly, the Senate, and go for validation. This is an extremely long process and complicated process. Since the declaration of President Macron, I think that was in 2017 in Ouagadougou, we have to acknowledge that things have started moving forward. The effect of a prince is different from a word of a normal citizen or an international organization. And I think that since President Macron made that statement, things have started moving forward, even though France is not moving the way it's supposed to. Since the report has been produced, 27 objects will be freed by a law. We have 26 artifacts which will go to Benin and one to Senegal, and we've already received it here. It's the sword of El Adjoa, which is a West African object, because I believe that all the countries of the sub-region have played a role in the Joma. Germany is more pragmatic and holistic in its approach, because what you can see with what is happening in Benin City since that Brussels organized by the British in 1897 with the detention in custody of Oba, it's estimated between 3,000 and 5,000 objects which have been sold around the world. We have to make difference between military looting and war objects that have been collected during wars, or other objects that some archaeologists have collected here and there, which have a less emotive impact. Let me get back to Germany. I think they are working hard on this memory part of the thing. Germany has a Nazi past, and we can see what they have done in Namibia and other countries, Nigeria. Things have started moving. In the Netherlands as well, they are doing tremendous work. They send back artifacts to Indonesia, some artifacts to Africa. England is still in Brexit for now, and I think that they are still negotiating and discussing about all that. But for now, the scene is set. The issue, sorry, let me mention something. I would like to talk about Belgium. Doing a wonderful work at the museum over there, and there is a transparency in the reorganization of the museum, because that museum had been built for King Leopold II, and the colonial impact is still there, but they are making efforts regarding the conceptual points. Now they are working with the Fundamental Institute of Black Africa on decolonization of natural and biological collections. Now, coming back to the trends today, the restitution is something irreversible. It's irreversible because I think the context has changed. I think that these objects that have been exiled will become one day ambassadors when the discussions will progress, and some of them necessarily will come back to Africa because we need them to settle some issues related to ownership of our collective memories on this continent. Restitution.
Can I move in that regard? Because what I understood from the excerpts that we already saw, but also from what you say, is that the objects can be used to further the conversation about heritage and about the taught heritage or the ownerships of heritage. What I understood in preparing this program is that the objects symbolizes much more than only the objects that they are. It symbolizes the relationship between certain African countries or countries of origin and Europe in that sense. And how should we regard it? Should we use the objects to mend the bond between the countries of origins and the Western countries, or should it solely be focused on returning objects and that's it?
Je ne sais pas, on peut créer.
I don't know, maybe we can create a bridge or start a break in all that. You know, these objects have a complicated past. If you study the documents, for example, the Great Mission of Dakar, Djibouti with Creole, it was clearly stated that now that they are colonized and dominated, let's take their soul. So when you take cult elements or to confiscate the memory of these people, I think that despite all this, these people have continued living and continue to create. Now, the problem lies in where the fact that what has been taken should certainly be restituted.
Right. If I could move the conversation to Pap here at the table as well, because what we heard just now is that objects should be returned. But I can also imagine that for the people from the diaspora who visit Quai Branly in Paris, that it's quite interesting to have such a prestigious institute where objects from several African countries that people can relate to are represented. That means, does that mean something in the emancipation of the diaspora in France?
Well, the restitution is a historical move that, as Amadi said, is unstoppable. Mm-hmm. So what we have to reflect onto are the conditions for those restitutions and the pace through which those restitutions will take place. And there is a lot to say about that. When it comes to the African diaspora, for example, in France or in European countries, no one argues, I believe, that museums, European museums, will be emptied. Mm-hmm. A lot will remain in these museums. When you think of the Quai Branly Museum, the Quai Branly exhibits about 10,000 items, mm-hmm. and it has 70 to 80,000 items in storage.
Right.
So there is so much to return, and the Quai Branly will remain an important museum featuring important exhibitions. So the argument which I read a couple of years ago suggesting that European museum will be emptied is nonsense.
Simply not true.
Literally. What really matters, I think, for many people, including myself, is to create the intellectual and conversation, a valid conversation between European institutions and African institutions. In order to do so, the restitutions have to be
But that conversation, why should that happen? Because many of the objects that have been taken, from example, from African countries, have a spiritual background. Using that to exhibit in a European museum is a European construct. Why should museums either on the African continent and here in Europe should have a conversation? Shouldn't the conversation be about, are these objects to be displayed at all? Shouldn't that be the foundation of the conversation?
Sure, and there are issues about displaying these objects, but as Suleiman Bachir Diagne said in the movie, we also have to admit the hybrid dimensions of these objects. It is impossible to get back to their original dimension, so to speak. For example, the pre-colonial dimension.
Because they have been transformed.
They have been transformed. They have been through historical processes. They have traveled. They have been taken by foreign hands, as someone said. So we have to admit that. We have to admit that it is impossible to clean those objects back to their originality, original dimension. So we have to admit that the historical dimension of those objects, the colonial dimension of those objects, which has not dirtied those objects, but which has transformed those objects and made something else of what they were originally.
Right, and I would like to pose a question to Amadi. Only one object from France has been returned up until now, and it's really a slow process. What I'm very curious to know is what happens to the objects. What is your idea for the objects when they return to Senegal? Are those objects to be displayed, or are those objects to be returned to the people who were related to the people that it was taken from? What are your ideas in regard to the objects?
La question est posée à moi?
Did you ask me the question? That's Professor Bokum speaking. I think yes. I think if these objects come back to our countries, we should not be thinking about what they should be. We could put them in museums. They could be in hotels. We could destroy them if we feel they are polluted. So this is not a problem. The problem is they should be restituted. There should be a rapport with communities. Communities have to feel that these objects are coming back. I would like to say that if these objects are now ambassadors, immaterial ambassadors, even though they are not plenipotential ambassadors, it's clear that it's not about the fact that they've stayed very long elsewhere, that they're no longer African objects. So for me, the fact that they stay over there is not an obligation. The fact that they are being transferred and that they are in exile has changed their identity. No. The main issue is they have to be restituted. Of course, these ambassadors, when they come back, they cannot be a plenipotentiary ambassadors. And it could be even between states and with other states in a relational level, institutionally speaking. For example, in Africa, there should be a common position on the restitution. In the sub-region, there is a plan that goes up to 2023 on that. So we have to put these issues on table, discuss them, and tackle them. So it's not about European Museum. It's not about the fact that being protected behind walls or screens. So there's no link between the fact that they have to be restituted or the fact that they should be protected over there in Europe.
Yeah, what I understand, and thank you for your contribution in that sense. What I understand is that it's not up to governments or museums in the West to decide what happens when they return, and if they should return. And the returning of the objects, that's an irreversible trajectory that already has started. And what happens to them after they've returned, that's not up to the West in order to decide that. Thank you so much for now, Amadi. We will return to you later. So if you could stay online, that would be very. I would be very happy. Let's move to the second part of the discussion, and that deals with displaying colonial collections or colonial collections from colonial context today. And let's see a clip from Chimamanda Adichie's speech at the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. She talked at the opening, and let's see what she had to say.
The Humboldt Forum was conceived as a place to tell the universal story of the human race from multiple perspectives. This is a commendable idea, but it is incomplete. Because again, we must confront the issue of power. Who tells the story? Who is the teller and who is told about? Who decided that African art should be labeled ethnological? Who has the right to exhibit the other?
Yes. Who has the right to exhibit the other? And we have to address the issue of power. Who does tell the story? Because this summer, the digital opening of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin stirred controversy. Displaying colonial treasures in a former imperialist palace provoked much outrage. And Chimamanda Adichie gave a keynote speech at the official opening of the Ethnological Museum and the Asian Art Museum. The position of power is always a discussion in this regard. I would like to ask everybody at the table, do you agree with Chimamanda Adichie in regard to this point? The issue is first an issue of power. Who could I give the floor first? Valika.
It very much is an issue of power, and we should be thinking about not only the ownership of the objects, but also the voices. Who gets to tell the story from the museums? So that was actually one of the first things that we tried to change in the Rijksmuseum when we started working on the slavery exhibition, is to change the work floor. Who is there? Who does the research? Who takes a second look at our collection? Who decides how to deal with it? And we changed the partnerships. Everybody we deal with outside of the museum. We brought knowledge in. We started new partnerships. So in every aspect of the museum, every department of the museum had new partners to work with. And that changed the narrative ultimately. And what we are striving to be is a museum that is the museum of every Dutch person, all the people who live in the Netherlands, and that includes the people who have ancestors who were enslaved. But
if I could interrupt you, working with partners is of course very important into getting different perspectives in the exhibition and different voices to be heard. On the other hand, it doesn't change the structure of power within the Rijksmuseum, because you work with partners who are externally, consulted to create the museum. The structure of power, the pyramid of hierarchy, isn't changed by working with partners. And isn't that what Chimamanda is addressing? That you should address the structures of powers, the structures of hierarchy.
Absolutely, and that's why I began saying that we needed to change the work floor as well. And we looked at the pyramid within the organization. I started out as a curator, brought in especially for this exhibition. Now I'm the head of the department. So we are trying to change the complete pyramid in the museum. But of course, it is a process that takes time. Right. But we need to keep doing this.
Marion, you would like to...
But perhaps we have to be honest, it's not possible to avoid structures of power, I would say. But concerning culture, culture is always part of an entangled history. So I'm convinced that culture evolves never isolated. It's always a transcultural process. Even with the Benin Bronzes, so the kingdom of Benin was very much. There were very many connections with the international other parts of the world in those years. So, if culture is a product of something which comes together and is hybrid always, what does it mean? So, but you can't avoid it. When you can't let the artworks always travel. So they are speakers. Even if we invite other people to have multiple perspectives on the artworks, we can't avoid it, I would say.
Can you? Because it's always putting others. Isn't exhibiting the objects, for example, the Benin Bronzes. Doesn't it always result in othering because it's presented as something exotic? It's presented as something ethnographical instead of looking at the origin or only looking at aesthetics. It's always it's a form of colonization, so to speak.
Oh, for sure, that's true, and so it's so important that these processes of restitution will happen, hopefully in Germany next year. But then you choose a place in Nigeria, and is it again a museum? And it's again a place of power. Somebody has to decide.
Yeah. How do we attack, Nanette, the position of power or the structures of power that we have? How can we deconstruct? Because decolonialization within museums is a main topic, and it happens everywhere. But still, even with decolonizing the museum, structures of power, othering, that's not changed. Giving objects another name, for example, doesn't change the structure of power or exoticism.
Yeah, well, I was in that room when Chimamanda Adichie was speaking about who tells the story, and I think this was a very, very important and symbolic discourse in the Humboldt Forum. So this problem of unequal power relationships, this is part of our society, and I think we must be very, very aware of those unequal relationships. So I am a little bit afraid that sometimes even the restitution debate is getting recolonized by white people.
And how do they do that?
Well, how do they do this? I'm here on this podium as a white director of a German museum. So, and I think that's why I'm very happy that the Musée des Civilisations Noires de Dakar is here on this podium, even if it is digital. But I think this awareness is very important, that in every step in the debate of restitution, we must be aware of this, because I feel that since 1 year we recolonize it a little bit.
We have to be aware who has a seat at the table. We have to be aware whose voices are being heard.
And to give power back.
And how do you share power or give power back? Who should take a seat at the table? Because even in the continent, in Africa, in the different countries, different opinions arise. If you look at Congo, people say, well, let's clean up our act first in Congo before we can talk about restitution. So there's not only one voice heard. So the diversity of different voices, how do you include them in these debates?
Well, one answer when it comes to French museums, for example, is to include communities and most primarily communities issued from the migrants, local communities, and talk to them so as to make the museums theirs. In a way, we should look at migrants, for example, and Afro-Europeans, not as the objects of our work, but as the subjects of our work. And most often, museums, at least in my country, tend to work on their own in their ivory towers, so to speak, before presenting whatever they have to the public and say, okay, this is an exhibit, please come. And the exhibit might be wonderful, but people are not included into the reflection, into the preparation of the exhibit. So one answer to what you were saying about the structure of power is to open the museum onto society and to have museums speak at the bottom up, so to speak, so as to be the museums of communities, not a museum, standing up there, but at a more approachable level.
And does that fit in the sense that, because internationally there's a lot of discussion about the position of museums, and what divides the international museum community is the statement that museums are not neutral places. Museums are places that take a stance and everything is politicized. Not every museum agrees with that. What is your idea? Are museums neutral places or are they politicized?
Museums are not neutral places, but they are not either political objects. So we have to think...
But what are they?
Yes, the opposite of neutrality is not political. The museums create spheres of understanding for other countries or other communities, for example, which are not neutral. There is a perspective, there is a historical discourse which can be found in museums for sure, but those discourses can also be heterogeneous. You can find different discourses, especially in large museums. It's not
within the same institution. You can have different discourses.
You can have different discourses.
On peut avoir différents discours, bien entendu.
We'll return to Amélie in a second, but because I would like to address this question to you, because the Humboldt Forum is not the only German case that was recently in the middle of a storm of controversy, and you're currently meeting a lot of resistance, and when the SKD retitled several objects, and that happened in the Rijksmuseum as well. Some objects were retitled. It did stir a little bit of controversy, but what happened in Germany?
So last year there was a lot of pressure because some initiatives wanted to tell us that we can't exhibit some works anymore. So the move was Emerald. So and then we discussed with them and we prepared a project to rename, retitle objects with a N word and M word, so Mu and Z word. It's Roma and Sinti. So there are some different groups. So the one is when there was really a mistake. So for example, La Négresse couchée de Rembrandt, it's a white person, but it was named La Négresse. Or Otto Dix made a portrait of a little girl, and she has a name, and it was Susu. And the later member of the staff of the museum in the 70s gave the title Negro girl Susu. So we decided to cancel all these mistakes. And then other groups, we decided to, when we found that the content is not acceptable anymore, but they are not original titles, we suggested new titles. And there was a real shitstorm in the last 3 weeks that it is not, that we have no right, that because it's a culture heritage of Germany and Saxony, and we don't have the right to give new titles. And it was it came from the right-wing party, and they used the media. They didn't understand that it was coming from there. And all our colleagues in whole Germany, they were against us that we don't have the right. So
there was no support for changing the names.
No support. So the 1 year we were attacked from the one side, and now we are attacked from the other side. But so we really are of the opinion the museum is no neutral space. So we have to take a stand. And the threats can be that we don't have any money anymore from the state. That's okay, we will survive it. But I think we need support, and we have to work internationally and all together on these questions. And I only wanted to
so as an international museum community where a lot of discussion is happening right now, what you're asking for is support in order to to change names which are given in a very much later stadium and not originally the artworks or the works or the objects weren't named originally as they were. So you need some help in that process. How can we help in that process?
Yeah, first to acknowledge that language has a key role. So the sensitive language is so important for every process to improve something. You can support, so Rijksmuseum has been one of the first museums who did that, but that we are discussing this on an international level altogether and also discuss what kinds of new language we can perhaps together find to describe.
What's your reaction to the political or the politicizing, because museums aren't political places, but this has been politicized by right-wing parties. What is your response to this situation?
Yes, obviously, museums, especially museums which deal with sensitive issues, such as immigration, that's the case of my museum, are under watch, especially from extreme right, xenophobic politicians who definitely consider those museums as threats to what they understand as a national unity, a national unity that excludes, of course, non-whites and people who do not belong to the country. So clearly, this is an issue because what we deal with are not only historical issues, we deal with the current times. We deal with the present. Who has what inequalities in our society? When we speak of issues such as slavery, for example, we also speak about the consequence of slavery in our current societies. That is why these museums generate so much controversy sometimes. That is why an exhibit on slavery is not some kind of cold object. It is loaded with current issues which we have to face clearly.
So am I correct in saying because those are debates that happen in society, these discussions and being in the eye of the storm is part and parcel of the decisions that have been made within the museum and then within the national context in that sense, because that's what happens in society as well?
Yes, and I think that we should not avoid these debates. We should not turn our eyes thinking that we don't need to enter the storm. We should get right at it with our tools, the tools of history, of the social science, of arts, science, and be part of the conversation with our own way to do things, to say things in a diplomatic way. I think it's possible to be calm on these issues, but we should not turn our eyes off these current time developments.
Yeah, you should address them and choose the tools within museums in order to do that. Nanette, can you explain to me in the German context, why is there a lack of support from other institutions?
I don't know if there is a lack of support of other institutions, but I think, as we say, museums are actually political spaces. It's a dream or a myth that we think that museums could be neutral spaces. So I think perhaps the lack of support is that all museums are a little bit afraid. They are getting aware that they are very political and that current debates are very linked to those museums. So I think it is a general reaction of museums that they would like to avoid it, what you say. So but I think we have to open the doors, radically open the doors for conflicts and show also solidarity for unheard voices. And that's what's going on now at the moment.
I would like to move the conversation to museum concepts and, like I said, about exhibiting the other, and that's what was mentioned before as well. You talked about the Benin Bronzes that you have currently. Can you explain in what context the Benin Bronzes are being displayed?
So at the moment, we took the decision not to show them anymore till the situation is more clear. So we are waiting for the next year, waiting for a delegation coming from Nigeria and select works they would like to have and they want to use, because we have more than 400. So it's a big group of works. So and then we hope that we can develop together forms of co-creating restitution, of course, but perhaps not every work. So I think they don't want to have every work, so they told us already. So we have to select together and see what stories we can tell in Germany, what we can tell there, how we can internationally work together, because these are masterpieces of art history, and we have to create new narrations together.
And what do you do in the meantime? Because I do understand the co-creation with other people, with other groups, with other perspectives. But we mentioned in the introduction that there are 3 ethnological museums.
Yeah.
What's the approach of the ethnological museums? Because that should be revised as well, shouldn't it?
Of course. So it's only in this case that we are really waiting for coming to a political solution, but of course we are in contact with the people. Then we have a museums lab, so we have an exchange program from different colleagues from African countries to come to our country. So we have several projects to work together on certain important questions. For example, we just spoke about that. It is a strange situation that we, in a way, rehumanize objects when we give them back, and on the other hand, how we speak about migrants. So these different discourses, different languages, we are discussing these topics at the moment very much in Germany. Then, of course, there are other topics, loss of language. So, for example, when you have a very traumatic experience, do you use your language? What is happening with societies or individuals after traumatic experience is something which we share in all over the world. And we have these projects to work together in co-creating groups in the 3 museums in 3 different locations.
Yeah. I would like to ask Amadi, should objects from a colonial era, I think it's very difficult to describe them, but let's, for lack of a better term, use that expression. Should objects from a colonial context even be displayed in Western museums nowadays? Not talking about the restitution, but the objects that are here, should they be displayed? What is your opinion on that, Amadi?
Bien. Mon opinion, c'est oui, et puis je vous dis
My opinion is yes, and I will tell you why. First of all, I think when I listen to my colleagues, my German colleagues, who have a lot of difficulties, the risk for us now is to enter a form of problem for the pros and against. According to me, the question is simple. The ethnographical museums are coming from other collections. On the disciplinary point of view, ethnology is the study of the other. We look at this object and we interpret them from an Occidental point of view, a Western point of view, and in a subordination relationship. That's to give you why I said yes. According to me, if we remain in these draconical sequences, we will still continue to analyze the history and the African production in sequences before colonization, during colonization, and after colonization. I'm talking about politics, and now we are talking about the colonization of these collections. We are in draconical sequences, and this is causing a lot of problems. Africa has not been planned to be colonized. Colonization is just a sequence that comes in the history of Africa. But when you are in a synchronic perspective, everything changes. Because in a synchronic perspective, a culture is a culture. All the cultures are equal, and we have the duty of not to subordinate So from that point of view, there is no difficulty in receiving here at the Museum of Civilisation Noire objects that are representative of Western cultures. We've received Leonardo da Vinci here. In few months, we are going to receive Pablo Picasso, and I would really like to receive here in Museum of Civilisation Noire the technologies of Hashtag. That's what we can call cultural essence. We have to be able to look at and discover African objects in Western museums and Western objects in African museums. Because if you keep that position of subordination, that's not good. We have to put an end to that. I am eager of discovering who the indigenous are in Europe, because you have discovered who the indigenous people are in Africa. So for me, the breaking line or what should be returned, and the modalities of dialogue and interpretation should be set in a perspective of unsubordination. That means a serious dialogue, a true dialogue of cultures. It's not only among specialists. The politics are doing their job, be it from the right or the left or elsewhere. They are looking for electoral targets, and they are trying to see what the audience is looking for, what the population is looking for. But now, at the African point of view, I think that the perspective is unsubordination. We respect your culture, and our cultures should be respected at the same level.
Right.
And if we
agree with that.
If we have a dialogue, we are going to find a solution together.
Great. Thank you so much for your contribution. Nanette, you've been curating items of ethnological collections since the start of your career. How do you respond to the response that Amadi just gave us?
Well, we speak at the same time about how to, if you have to display, your question was also, do we have to display, for example, Benin Bronzes? For us at the Rouwsstraat Museum in Cologne, we have an exhibition about resistance, anti-colonial resistance, and in this exhibition we have a kind of autonomous spaces. So here we have invited different curators from the Global South, mostly activists, in order to tell their own story. And in this exhibition, for example, we exhibit all our 95 Benin Bronzes, which are in our collection. So we try to show transparency and to show the debate. So it's in this autonomous space curated by Pejula Iwola. She speaks about how to deal with this memory of colonial violence, how could it be restituted? What does it mean for Nigeria, for Nigerian people, for Nigerian artists? So I think in the museum at this moment, it is so important to show transparency and to tell all those stories we are dealing here on this podium.
Right.
So,
and the transparency of making that debate visible, you inviting activists in order to be part of the museum, of the institution, and of the exhibition. In this day and age, that's quite important because even the Benin Bronzes are not neutral objects anymore. They are the point of debate, and you should display them as the point of debate as well. Right. Pap, if I could go to you, the National Museum of the History of Immigration is housed in the Palais de la Portée Dorée, which is the most spectacular colonial monument in France, you can say, and that's where you landed. What does that imply for the collection and the exhibitions you present?
Well, it implies that the monument itself is not just a roof where the museum is located. The monument needs to be explained the proper way. It is not just a superb monument Art Deco of the 1930s celebrating its 90th anniversary this year. It is also a monument of colonial propaganda, and this needs to be explained.
And so is it a takeover, or is it a redesign, or is it decolonizing that space?
It is about providing a historical discourse, building a historical discourse so that this monument makes sense to our current society, so that when people visit this monument, they can reflect onto what this monument is about. That is, it talks a lot about the colonial times, and it's also very silent about the reality of colonization. That is, there is nothing on violence, of course, in this building. So we need to reintroduce history.
And we've got an image here where one of the biggest rooms are being redesigned. How does that fit in the context of what you're explaining at the moment?
Yeah, we are redesigning the permanent exhibit starting with the year 1685. So this is just a display of one of the rooms here that will be opened in the fall of 2022. 1685, that's a very important date, as it was the release of the famous or notorious Black Code that provided the legal basis for the slave trade and slavery. So we start with this issue of the slave trade, which is a form of migration, obviously, which is a way to say, okay, we as a national museum feature and talk about slavery. That's the first time that a national museum in France talks about slavery in metropolitan France. So that's quite a statement, which is a way for us to say, okay, we are in a colonial museum, and we're intersecting the history of migrations and the colonial history, so that this museum and the monument make sense together.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I would like to close this round off with a quote from Amady, because the MCN opened its doors in 2019, and with an interview with Le Temps, Amady stated the following: "We have opted for 4 main principles: not to be a chromatic museum, not to be an ethnographic museum, not to be an anthropological museum, not to be a subaltern museum. Briefly, not to try what the Musée du Quai Branly or the Smithsonian do." Amady, if I could ask you, it's very interesting that usually in a statement, people say what they are going to do, and in this statement, you define what you're not going to do. Why did you choose that approach, and how does that connect to what you are going to do?
Oui, bon, en fait, c'est pas moi qui ai inventé ça, c'est le résultat de la réflexion pendant une semaine de plus de 150 experts sur la préfiguration.
I was not the one that invented it. More than 150 experts came together, and then that's how the statement came up. So that's the statement. But no ethnologic, no chromatic, and no subordination. So what would there be? So we said that the museum would be a museum that would be inclusive. So we feel that our world is moving very fast, that even those materials we use to exhibit may be obsolete in 2 years to come as things are changing. So when we go for a museum that is changing, it should be a museum that is open to all discourses, that is participatory. And that takes me back to the fundamental principle that I said what we should not be. We are not going to be chromatic. We are not going to be ethnographic. And most importantly, there will be no subordination. So the relation we have with the public, the relation we have with other museums, we should have a position that is open. Everybody will come together at a table. Even the public will come and join in the debate. So it's a museum that will reflect what people like. We said that Africa is gave birth to humanity, and humanity comes from this earth. So we have to go back to the fundamental. We have to come back to the reconstruction of humanity. We have the same origin, we are one. So when we think that way, that forward thinking, it will help us to improve the public discourse of our museums.
Right. Thank you so much. Valika, can I ask you to respond to what we just heard by Amadi, and how can that be related to what happens in the Rijksmuseum?
Yeah. Sure, yes, really interesting what you're saying, especially the last part, that you bringing in the public to reflect on what you're doing and try and come to new narratives together with that public. That's exactly what we've been trying to do since preparing the slavery exhibition, for example. When we did that, we were very transparent from the beginning. We announced that we were going to be working on a new exhibition, and that created a lot of response. A lot of people feel a connection to the museum and feel that it's their property as well. So we were able to work with so many opinions and ideas that were put forward. We organized that as well. We took people along on our journey when we used new language, for example. So it has really been a process, a transparent process in which you come together and you come to new narratives. We've spoken a few times here at the table about how to display objects. What we've also been trying to do is look at how do you bring objects together to together speak about new, bring over new narratives. Because the Rijksmuseum, for example, our whole collection is really based on the wealth and the power that was in the Netherlands all the time. And if you take a good look, that is a very colonial narrative, because the wealth and the power was based on conquering other people, on building plantations elsewhere, on making the people the subaltern. So taking a second look at what we already have and bringing in those new objects that add to enable us to speak about the violence that was part of that, enable us to speak about the effect that it had on other parts of the world, that enables us to make a completer sense of what is Dutch history. Dutch history is not just the glory and the fame and the wealth we amassed. It is also what we did to other people that have become.
But that caused a stir as well a couple of years ago, and I was part of it. We had the Golden Age debate, where the Amsterdam Museum decided not to use the term Golden Age anymore because it wasn't a positive or a golden period or golden era for everybody. That met a lot of resistance, comparable what Marion just described, because people felt history was erased, history was being altered, and if we talk about redefining narratives, if we talk about new narratives and inviting people at the table, we have to be aware, like Pap also said, that is politicizing museums, and we should be aware that that happens and be aware of the resistance. But even in that Golden Age discussion, there was no common solidarity within the different kinds of museums. Even the museum world was divided in using that term. What strategies should we choose in order, if museums become political spaces, what strategies should be used in order to further that debate?
I think we have two instruments, and one we've already discussed, that is bringing in the people and having that debate, having that dialogue, so not to confront people with a change, but to take them along on your journey. And once they've done that, and they are able to do that in a safe space, you bring people together that have one idea and other people that have another idea. They are able to speak about it, and they feel heard. That's already heard in the sense that they've been heard, not
listened to,
hurt.
yeah.
That is really important. And I think something else that's really important, what we've tried to do with the slavery exhibition, is not to be too political about what we're speaking about. Of course, there's politics in there, but we try to be as objective as we can to
But that's impossible. That's what we just learned at this table. You cannot be too political or not political at all, because it is political. You have to take a stance, and I think
yes, we take a stand by presenting a slavery exhibition at the Rijksmuseum. That is already a political stance. But then, in the narrative that we brought forth in the exhibition, we presented all the facts that we had, and the people were able to make their own story about it.
But still, it was not a glorification
really
of that. It wasn't the glorification of the 17th and 18th century. It wasn't a glorification of the wealth that was amassed. It was a view of abuse. It was a view of how systems worked, which is quite political. It's not only a little political, it's very political.
Absolutely. The choice to mount that exhibition was a political one, but then I think a lot of the regular visitors expected a exhibition that was going to tell them with a wagging finger what to think, and it was not. And we got a lot of reactions that people really valued that, really appreciated that they were able to make up their own minds walking through the exhibition.
And that's what you mean with taking people along instead of presenting them with a certain stance or a certain decision.
That is part of it, but what I was also talking about is trying to be as objective as you can, trying to present the facts and not push a certain narrative.
We can talk about this in the bar. One radical narrative change that Amadee just introduced was something that I think is very interesting, changing the narrative where we realize or acknowledge or even promote the idea that Africa is the origin of humanity. That does something with the European perspective or the domination of the European perspective. What would the reaction be if the 15 museums that you're the head of would present Africa as the origins of humanity and in a certain regard also the origins of civilization?
That's a very good question, and it would really a challenge to make this experiment to change the whole narration of the museums, even if it's only for one project and an exhibition to try out what happened. And to tell this story from this point, from beginning from Africa as center, and then turn the whole thing the other way around. I think it was never done. I don't know about a similar project. It could be possible, and could be really my heart is beating. It could be something we could try, and I would say this would be so surprising that the people would be overwhelmed in a way, and it is perhaps easier than what we are doing. Of course, I have to agree, my colleague. It's a reason why I'm skeptical towards the question of power, because if we have a stand and are not in a neutral place, then we need our own power. We need our power, for example, to refer to that arts and science are free in Germany. We need our own power to come through with our opinions. But when we make something which is so surprisingly new, then it's much more than overcoming Eurocentrism. It's a totally new narration, and that would be very good to do this, to try this.
And that could be radical as well. Pap, should we all know the painting L'Origine du Monde, and the origins of the world. Should we change that, exchange the L'Origine du Monde by just a map of Africa and rename that the L'Origine du Monde?
Why not? But let's imagine 1 second that Africa is not or was not at the origin of the world of human beings. Would it change anything? How would it change our narrative related to the debate on restitution, how would it change our view onto Africa? So I'm not fully convinced that the discourse on the origins of the world is so efficient from a scientific and even from a political standpoint. I don't think.
Don't you think it happened something with the idea of superiority, where Europe was seen, or Greece was seen as the basis of civilization? And isn't it about changing the narratives and changing power structures? Isn't acknowledging that what Benedict Savoy in the beginning clip said as well, it's an acknowledgement of Europe that the empire has been lost. It's the acknowledgement that European Western superiority isn't quite based in reality. Isn't that narrative also important in this discussion?
I'm not so sure. I think you could easily find xenophobic and racist people in Europe that would acknowledge that human beings come from Africa, but then they would say, okay, but then civilization grew and we in Europe came to be superior one way or another. So I'm not sure about the efficiency of this discourse on the origins, which is an interesting discourse for sure from a scientific standpoint, but I'm not sure about the performative dimension of this discourse on current societies and current politics.
Okay. We're entering the final stage of this conversation, and in the final 15 minutes I would like to give the floor to the people here in the audience and the people in the car as well to ask some questions. So if you've got some questions prepared, please post them in the final 15 minutes. And the final part I would like to introduce with the following statement. According to Suleiman Bashir Diagne, repairing history lies in interaction and collaboration, and he put it like this: restitution cannot simply be a return to the kingdom following exile. It must draw on the wealth of new energies and meaning with the objects in question, which the objects in question have produced the art world and will continue to produce after their return. To emphasize that the time has come to reinvent the museum as a realization of networks and synergies. These objects, which, in the words of Amado Matar Mbao, have put down new roots everywhere, they have been, and now have a role to play in building bridges and thus in forging this new kind of museum network. Why is this quote, and I would like to pose the question to Marion and Annette, why is this quote fundamental to the museum lab which both of your museums participate in? Annette, could I give you the floor?
Yeah, this is a very, very important quote for the museums lab. I consider it that Suleiman, he underlines, and also the museums lab underlines that restitution is a matter of justice, but also restitution is not the end of a relationship. So it will build a new relationship. So I see it like this.
If you say build a new relationship, isn't that just a form to keep influence with the objects that have been restituted?
That could be. You are right to pose this question, but I think we are all aware of it. But I think we have to reinvent or invent new relationships, and this on an equal basis. And we spoke at the beginning about those unequal relationships, which is a fact. And I think here, with the Museums Lab and with this quote, here we are aware of this, and I think there is a possibility to invent equal relationships between Africa and Europe.
Right. What are the core values of the Museum Lab?
So I would agree to Nanut. So it's not the end, the restitution, it's the beginning. And the Museums Lab wants to emphasize this, and I would say it's also about knowledge. So to be honest, we don't really know so much about the culture of each other. So returning to the example of Benin Bronzes, they were most of the time the depots of the European museums. The broader audiences know nothing about the culture. It was in the time of what you name in Europe Renaissance, High Renaissance. So the Museums Lab is also about these very precise forms of knowledge. And knowledge, I think, it's the grounding for being full of respect towards each other, and then to develop this relationship. It is, I think it's this restitution is a great chance to develop something which is really new, which hasn't been existed before.
Right. And informing those relations, that could help decolonizing the institutions as well, because if I understood correctly, you're quite critical on the current state of decolonization within museums. Why is that?
Because decolonizing is becoming a kind of tokenism. So this debate is mainly held by Europeans, and it is as if we are, and I am involved in this, so I'm aware of my role, and as if we are so decolonizing, and there is a kind of competition even between museums, which museum is the most decolonizing. And I think this is also perhaps an attempt of European museums to maintain their power. So I think this is at the moment a risk.
As long as you're decolonizing, you shouldn't give up your power or give up your position. Because you're aware. You're aware of the problem, and that's the way of addressing that. And the Museum Lab is an alternative in order to have that conversation on an equal footing and to have that equal exchange about each other's narratives and about each other's stories without a dominant narrative being present there, at least that dominant narrative that stems from culture. Valika, should we, in the Netherlands and in France as well, should we have those museum labs in order to further that conversation too?
I think that would be an excellent idea, and actually it's already started, and not by our museum, but by the Museum of World Cultures, together with a lot of other museums and universities in the Netherlands, to start a new project on looking for how to exactly go about provenance research, but also how to look at the value we put on heritage and how do we deal with that. And that will take place not only in the depots and in the museums, but also by bringing people together and rethinking how to exhibit this and how to bring this to the fore.
Great. And what are the developments in France?
Yes, well, a good start would be to comment the objects and provide the historical explanations which are still missing in most ethnographic museums about the conditions under which they came to Europe, to talk about the looting, the product of looting that they embody. So there is a lot to do when it comes to our relationship to these items. It's an opportunity. I think it's a wonderful historical opportunity to reinvent the very meaning of a museum. What do we mean when we present objects? So we can do that, or we can also interpret this historical process on a more narrow path with restitution, with issues of justice, which are important, of course, but I think we can do more.
And how important is international unity in order to redefine what museums are? Because the discussion at the moment divides museums internationally as well. Should we all work towards a solution where everybody can agree with each other on what the definition of museums is, or should there be a divide in different interpretations? What's your opinion about that?
If one waits for all museums to agree on something, we could wait forever. Okay, so I think it is important to move forward, build coalitions with museums willing to do something, and see what happens. I think what matters is to start moving to do things along with other museums willing to engage into a sincere conversation with museums and African partners, if it's Africa or other areas of the world, of course, not waiting for some kind of unity that may not come at all.
Right. I would like to give the audience here and in the car as well to ask some questions. Is there anybody who would like to pose a question to the panel? Yes, there's a question in the back. Just have if you have a second, the microphone is coming towards you, so everybody at home can hear your question as well.
Yeah, okay, that's better. I was going to ask on the point this evening we've been discussing about these conflicts within and backlash. So, for example, with the renaming of the objects and, for example, the backlash to the Golden Age, removing that here in the Netherlands. And part of that discussion, actually, what I'm interested in is that we talk about it, what can the museum do to change that discussion? But for me, I think my first memories of going to a museum was with school. For example, I went to the British Museum, and you see those items explained by your teachers and through the educational system. And that, I think, narrative, especially in Western societies for public opinion, comes through education, how you're brought up. From, I think, 7 or 8 is probably my first realization is why there are Egyptian objects there. And my question is to what extent can the museum networks or museums influence the educational systems or education and the curriculum and what we actually learn in schools?
Right. Thank you for your question. Who would like to respond to that question? Marion.
Congratulations, that's a very good question, but not so easy to answer. So because in every place itself it happens. So, but of course, in this international collaboration, we can learn from each other. So I would say everybody at the moment is working with forms of participation of schools and people from all ages. But it even is not enough, I would say. So it's so just referring to what I just experienced at the moment, that the society is so much divided into parts, and it's so difficult to work with the locals because they are some of them are quite xenophobic and quite extreme, and it always sounds so idealistic to who Amadeus was saying. The museum has to reflect what the people would like to do. Mm. But when you are in a community where you hate what the people say, and but you don't want to be something like an educator and tell the people what they have to think. It's very difficult to find new forms.
But again, why shouldn't you be an educator and try to explain what people or what your position is and try to forge alliances with people that agree with the view on the world that you have in order to bring that about?
Yeah, because our whole story is that we should unlearn and we should give away power and we should not educate. And yes, it's quite. Yeah. It's but perhaps one of my colleagues has an answer for you.
Well, I would like to broaden the perspective as well, because I understand what you say about education and about the programs that could happen in museums where you change the narratives or change perspectives. But from a museum point of view, it's also about educating curators and adding different voices or different kinds of curators in the institution. And Valika, the change is already happening in the Rijksmuseum. But if you attract new curators, how should you go about to include new voices, and what should the requirements be in order to become a curator of a prestigious museum? Should you be an art historian or not? Or what is your view on that?
Yeah, good question. If you keep looking for the same kind of people, then you will keep finding them, and the museum will never change. So if you want to change what you're presenting, you need to be attracting other kinds of people with other knowledge. So that is one of the main things we are trying to do, not just attract new people. For example, in my department, it's not just historians, we're the historical department, but there's also a sociologist, and me, myself, I'm not a historian either. I studied museums and the connection to national narratives and what different countries are putting forward when they are dealing with traumatic history. So I think you need to bring in these people with different kind of knowledge, and together you can change what the museum is putting out.
And in dealing with xenophobic views, or in dealing with visions that are not representative of the values of the museum, how do you go about into telling narratives? Because like every country in Europe, France also has its problems with migration, with the image that immigrants have. How do you force those narratives in order to them to be the narratives that you would like to tell them?
Yeah.
And how do you oppose the voices that maybe oppress those narratives?
My answer would be pedagogy. We need to provide the right pedagogy so that people are not, how would I put it, attacked, or the exhibits have to include people, even people who may be a little reluctant. For example, we have children from various families which may have xenophobic views. So what do we do with them? So the answer is, let's bring them, let's talk to them, let's make them sure that what they see, what they learn at the museums are the product of research, objective understanding of history. So I believe very much into the pedagogical dimension of museums. I also believe very much into the fact that curators, at least in France, are all come from a very homogeneous background, and we need more diversity among curators. To put it briefly, a classic museum in France has its security and its janitors all black, and then the curators are all white, right? And this is not a caricature. This is the reality, the sociological reality. So we need to make sure that people working in museums, including at the higher level, reflect the reality of French society, reflect it much better than they do now.
And that means changing the definitions of what quality is or what the requirements are in order to be employed at the museum. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, and there's another question there.
Yeah, I have also a question to Mr. Diaye. I hope this is the right name for you. Yes, I have been in your museum, and I think there are not so many objects of other continents, but these objects are mainly in the Musée Branly. So I would like to know how you can work together maybe with that other museum. And the second question is if you also bring the debate to the banlieues or to La Défense, to the commerce. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Indeed, we don't have anymore an ethnologic collection, as it was transferred to the Quai Branly 15 years ago when the Quai Branly Museum opened. This was in 2006. So what we are trying to do is at least get our archives back, the archives of the 1931 exhibit in Paris, get some important objects that belong to the monument, and but we're not trying to get back the African, Asian, and Pacific area objects as they belong to the Quai Branly, and also because we don't want to get back to square one, so to speak, and become again what we distanced ourselves from, that is an ethnographic museum. I would feel very uncomfortable working in an ethnographic museum as a historian, so I'd rather work in this colonial monument and do what I can as a historian to explain what this monument is about, and as I said, connect the Museum of Immigration to the monument, to make the Museum of Immigration, to make sense of the museum within this colonial monument. But yes, the Quai Branly Museum has to deal with the objects which do not belong to us anymore.
But can I pose a question in regard to that? Because why is it going back? No, shouldn't we change the narratives as well? Because to regard objects as ethnological objects, it defines them in a way that's not really positive. Another trend in museums that you see at the moment is transhistorical exhibitions where different objects from different backgrounds are being brought together. So you can use so-called ethnographical objects, which should have another definition, also to enforce the narrative that you would like to bring to the audience. Is that an approach where it is possible to take some objects from Quai Branly back to your museum in order to tell a different story?
That's a very good point. I have to think about it.
I can develop it for you. I will come to Paris.
Or to have you as a curator.
Oh,
I'd be many ideas already for exhibitions.
I'd be very much pleased. But yes, this is a good point. If I can add just a point on the suburbs and what you are also trying to do is outreach to areas and to people which do not come to the museum, to have some small exhibits that can travel. But I've also noticed that people, when they come, people of immigrant descent, for example, when they come to the museum, they're also proud. They're also proud to be welcomed in such a beautiful museum, to have such a kind of grandeur in a way, Art Deco with the paintings and the sculptures, and I think it's a way to say, okay, you're welcome in a palace. It's in a monument that provides a sense of, wow, our history matters since it is located in such a beautiful building with its historical issues for sure, but it has some grandeur, which I think is important.
And that has got to do with ownership as well. Ownership of that palace, which is connected to that grandeur, and where other stories that you feel represented by are being presented as well, and that makes you owner of that space.
Absolutely.
That transhistorical aspect that I just highlighted, you said you already work in that way. Can you explain that?
Yeah, completely, because we are, at the moment, we have this exhibition about 500 years of anti-colonial resistance, where we actually try to show our objects in our collection from another perspective, as objects, as fragments of actions of resistance in the past. So we can, of course, use this historical collection because it is an historical collection. They have all been collected in the 19th century until the 40s. So we can have also an historical perspective on those objects, and I would say not to de-ethnography the objects. And that is a very important thing for so-called ethnographic museums.
Right. Right, thank you so much. Are there any other questions, either here on Dakar as well? Amadi, you've listened to that conversation. Are there any questions from there?
Dans la salle, si quelqu'un veut intervenir.
Maybe someone would like to ask a question here. Yes, we have people raising their hands. We will give them the floor for their question.
Bonsoir, merci beaucoup pour ce débat.
Good evening. Thank you for organizing this interesting debate. I would like to come back on what Professor Amadi Bokoum was saying. He explained that when you return an object to the owner, you don't ask him what he's going to do with that object. He also recalled that the objects that have been taken in African countries have not been taken in glasses, and they are not going to be sent back in these glasses. Maybe some of them will come in that form, but others may come such as sacred, like sacred shrines, or others can be destroyed. I would like to have the point of view of the panelists around the table about that. Thank you.
So what is your view on the fact that we, as Western countries or institutions, don't have a say in what happens when objects are being returned? Is that something you agree with, or should? Let's pose it. I will pose it a bit more sharply than was asked. Are those objects part of a world cultural heritage that transcends the boundaries of a country, and should we appeal to that responsibility to preserve those objects?
Yes, I would say yes.
You would say yes?
Yes, I would. I think we have a common responsibility to preserve that.
But Nanette doesn't agree.
I'm sorry. I'm here a little bit, perhaps a little bit radical, but I really think that we cannot decide what will happen with robbed objects, and particularly when we speak about sacred objects. It's not up to us to tell how to deal with it. And I think restitution, repatriation is giving back, and it has been robbed. And
without any strings attached.
And I think, yes, because this is really, we speak about colonial wounds, colonial trauma. And I think restitution is this. This is also a matter of healing. I understand, Marion, that of course it's an important heritage, world heritage. But I think here, in the context of this colonial violence, of hundreds of years of colonial violence, I really think that restitution is giving back, and it's up to the African continent, to the first owner, to decide what he could do with it.
I will go to you in a minute, Pap, but what was said as well, the first owners aren't there anymore, so who will you give them back to? So there aren't first owners, so how would you deal with that problem?
I think it's because sometimes we really forget that those objects are living objects. They are in the memory, and they have left an emptiness in those countries. So, of course, the people who are living now, they are not, well, they have changed, of course. But I think you have to give it back. I'm sorry for being a little bit radical.
Don't be sorry for that at all.
I agree with you. I think that they have to be returned, and Africans will take good care of these objects. Why shouldn't they take good care of these objects? And as you said, they are living objects. They are not in Africa. They have been in Africa for a long time, but they are in the memories. They are somewhere. And they are longing to be returned. And of course, they belong to humanity as a whole, but they first and foremost need to be where they belong first. And Africans took good care of those objects before colonization. Why shouldn't they now?
Right. Thank you so much. Any other questions from the car?
Il y a une question. Il y a une main qui est levée.
Yes, there is a question. Good evening to you all. I would like to come back on Amadi Bokoum's intervention regarding the fact that what Africans can do about these objects that are returned. But when something belongs to you, you do whatever you want with it. But the real question is, send back these objects to put them in their museal context, the museal context in which they were, sorry. That's all the reflection on the model of a museum. And behind that model, which is part of colonial concepts, we've been told that we don't have the resources, you can't keep those objects, those that you have there are not trained to maintain them. But let's tell this, these objects were in the secret forest here. They stayed there for centuries. They were not in AC, not in glasses, but they were in the forest, and they were well kept in time. What many don't know is that it's not any wood that is used to produce a ritual object. So the wood has been selected based on a certain expertise, and the conservation is not the real question. The other question that no one would like to address is the paradigm shift. Europe has observed this object with its exotic view, and it has totally forgotten that these objects that were social cohesion objects that brought together people around them, even when they left, that those people remain and found other ways to come together and create other objects which have stronger value within those communities. So, and if we have to compare these objects to those that left 1 century before, in the same village, from the same village, the same area, today the object that we have in 2021, which continues to be used in an ancestral rite in an African country in 2021, has an inestimable value, and it exists. Let us not believe that everything has been taken from us. We have academia who needs these objects like the way they are displayed in Europe, so that they can analyze them and learn about them. But the real question is, let us not believe that Africa has lost it all. We've kept a great part of what belonged to us, of what created the link between African people, and that could not disappear just like that, just with an event because a country is stronger than the other. These people continue to live. We still have the sacred woods, the sacred forests that exist, and these experiences have been transmitted from one generation to the other, and it transcends time. So that's what I wanted to share with you. It was not a question, actually. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. Is there anybody who would like to react on that? Because not everything was lost, not everything was taken away. The culture still is there and is preserved. Is there anybody who would like to react to that?
Well, j'aimerais bien dire quelques mots.
Yes, I would like to share some words with you on this last part of the discussion. First of all, regarding the relationship between these objects and the power that the European institutions have, it is not really true, because Africa has not produced only during colonial period. It produced before, and it continued producing after. Saying that 90 or 95% of African heritage is in Western museum is not true. This could be true only if we have that colonial perspective, and for me, that is not true. Africa continues to produce. Africa continues to have a greater part of its heritage on this continent. Archaeology is a discovery every day. Contemporary production is creativity every day. We need to look at that, and let's not look behind all the time. That is the trap of restitution. It's to remain having a look at the back. We are continuing moving forward. So it's not having an eye on the past, that we are going to take into consideration creativity in Africa. Restitution is important. However, we should not essentialize it. Otherwise, we will forget a lot of things. And objects don't have the same importance. I want to insist on the fact that objects that I suppose that have been taken from in colonial periods, like objects exposed in Berlin, objects coming from Dahomey or Benin, etc., shows that the return is important. Regarding the model of museum, we need to be open. I talked about insubordination right now, but I'm not the first person to talk about it. Alpha Omar Konaré was the president of Mali, and he said something: we need to put an end to the model of European museum in Africa. We need to invent something new. And it's in that invention that we are. Where are we going? We don't know yet, but I believe that there will be various models. We are not going to have only one model, a single model, but we are going to have various models. I also encountered some difficulties in understanding Mr. Ndiaye when he made the difference between humanity and civilization. I don't know any civilization that is not human. And when we say that Africa is the cradle of the humanity, it's not a matter of civilization, it's a constatation. When Europe says that it's the cradle of civilization, we can all accept that all the civilizations are equal. So saying that Africa is a cradle of the humanity is a constatation. So there is no need to oppose this point of view. Or I don't know, I don't think that we can oppose cradle of humanity and civilization, because I know there is no cradle of civilization. We have civilizations all over the place in the world. That's what I wanted to share with you.
Great. Thank you so much. You would like to react, is that still the case?
Perhaps it was just because we spoke both about, and also here, the museum as an European invention. I think that is at the moment the problem, because the restitution debate is between government and government, or between museum and museum, and how to deal in the future with restitution of sacred objects to communities, families, and so on. That is what I wanted to say. But
right.
After that, we spoke about it.
There are a lot of topics that are covered. And unfortunately, we are reaching the end of the program because of time restraints. I would like to pose everybody with a final question to conclude the evening. And that is, if your museum could take one concrete step in terms of restitution or exchange or collaboration, what could that actually be? I will start with you.
Me first. I would say we face already the restitution of the Benin Bronzes next year. So this will be a very important step. So the question will be, do we restitute 450 works or fives in a symbolic way? And do we give it back, or do we perhaps make an exchange? There was also a very nice conversation between museums colleagues from Nigeria and us, if we would be interested in contemporary art from this country. And we said, oh yes, that's the one, they have wonderful contemporary artists. Perhaps we could do something like an exchange of artworks. And then it could be, the next step could be, so finally, after waiting for such a long time, exhibiting something together or in separate countries. So I would say at the end of next year, we know how we will go on, and that would be an important move for many other themes we have in common.
Right. Valika?
I think the same goes for us, that we've already started the conversations that we think are important. We would like to extend on that, of course. But at the moment, for example, we are working on a new exhibition on the revolution in Indonesia that made the country independent of the Netherlands. So that is really new for a Dutch museum to be taking that approach. And in that team, we are working with curators in Indonesia on our working floor, and those are also the people who are involved in the restitution process. So that way we are establishing new relationships in a permanent way.
Thank you. Amaury, could I ask you the same question, and what concrete steps MCN could take?
Ben, nous, au niveau du Sénégal,
Here in Senegal, in my museum, the museum is not born from collections, so I don't have any collection. There is nothing, I don't have much to restitute. I have everything to get back, and I don't have traceable objects.
But is there anything you could offer in collaboration or in exchange? Because I do think that we could learn from your museum as well.
Yes, we have some collections we can exchange, and we are in a global space. We have a lot of museums and big collections with the government. We have also collections of Cheikh Anta Diop, which is almost everywhere in the world, and I think that we can exchange these collections. And for the rest, I believe that what is important at this moment for Senegal on this restitution matter, we have a special commission which is being implemented, and that commission will help the decision makers to look at this issue, identify the objects, and set up a methodology. So we are working on it. And in principle, that commission will be set up in 2 and 3 weeks' time. That commission will help the government in the sub-regional perspective, that is ECOWAS perspective, and regional perspective with the African Union in order to have a common position. I think the objective will not be to empty, to take everything from Western Museum, but to set up a good collaboration and learn what exists in those museums and find out how, in an organized way, what should be brought back in following a timeline. So it's time for discussion, for exchanges. I was very moved by the difficulties that our German colleagues are encountering in their museums. What is being said in the public opinion and which has an impact on the museum, all this is complicated. You have to be strong enough to continue this fight and do the work, what is being done, according to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Nanette.
Yeah, well, also for us in Cologne, it is becoming very concrete. We are dealing with restitutions from Cameroon, Kenya, and particularly with Nigeria because of the Benin Bronzes. Very concrete. At the end of 2022, there will be the first returns of Benin Bronzes from German collections to Nigeria. So, and next year we will open a space in our permanent collection we call I Miss You, where we will deal with all different kind of restitution requests. So, yes, this is our future, or this is our museum reality.
Right.
And it's very interesting.
And the steps already have been taken, and it's irreversible at the moment.
Exactly.
Right? Is it, again, that's what I wonder, is it irreversible? What we see is, in the political sense, is a move to the right. Is it feasible that politicians in future will say, we do not agree with restituting objects and we block it, that should stay in our country?
Of course, there is this risk, but we are in a federal republic, Germany. So here we are in very, very different positions. But still, nevertheless, I think when you think of the history of restitution debates since the end of the 19th century, the very first request from the Benin Kingdom was several months after 1897. So it's more than 120, 130 years of restitution debates. Now we speak about very, very concrete steps of the restitution, and the Benin Bronzes have become the icon of the restitution debate. So I think we cannot go back.
Right.
But perhaps I'm naive.
But
I would say it could happen, but it would be blocked. So it's still not realized yet. And because, especially in Germany, it's a federal system, it's always the question who decides. So when we restituted the human remains, the Minister of Culture of the Länder had to decide. But in other cases, the parliament of the Länder, of the countries, has to decide. In this case, the government of Germany decided to restitute the Benin Bronzes, but the law would say many people has to decide on that. So it's not done yet. So
right.
we have to fight for that because we believe in the necessity. Yeah. But I would still, there's also reason for some concerns.
Yeah. We have to still be agile and...
the skeptical one this evening.
No. Or maybe the realistic one, that's possible as well. To close off with you, Pap.
Yeah, we don't have any items to restitute at the Museum of Migration, but we have thousands and thousands of stories to restitute.
Right.
The untold stories of the migrants who came from out of the world, who came from whatever country that need to be told, especially migrants from Sub-Saharan Africa, from Far East Asia, as well as from the Caribbean. So this effort to restitute the stories is also, of course, of primary importance, not only to our society, our European society, but also to the people, to the societies these people came from.
Right.
So that's
so
what we are doing.
That adds to the narrative, to challenge dominant narratives that are there at the moment and add new narratives internationally seen as well.
Absolutely.
Right, thank you so much. And we've come to the end of this evening. And what I noticed from tonight is that the objects that are being returned or restituted are symbols for much more than only objects what they are. They symbolize a relationship between the West and between other countries. They symbolize a discussion, a debate that's happening where we redefine what structures of power are at the moment and how they can be challenged, and how they can be challenged on a governmental but also on a local museum level as well. It's the start of a conversation where the objects can be ambassadors of that conversation about the relationship between countries, about institutions, and even take the concept of a museum and challenges it. Is it the way that we should go forward? Is it a way to exhibit cultures or exhibit people, or is it being used to expose the other, or is othering a central focus point that should be challenged? And as we saw from the quote from Chimamanda Adichie, who is in power, and can we challenge who is telling the story? And can we move on without looking too much backwards? Can we move on in order to have a shared history that all voices, all perspectives are being included in that? Well, hopefully this restitution is a first step in that regard. And even though we have to be aware that there are still many objects and obstacles in the way to return the objects, this is a good start. This conversation is a good start. And let's see what happens in the end of 2022 with the Benin Bronzes and use that as an example to go forward. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for sharing the stories. Thank you in the car for joining us here in the conversation, and hopefully we will continue this conversation later. Bye-bye from the Bali.